So I often get asked by people who are either just starting an agency or maybe they haven't even started one, how do they actually get stuff done? Oftentimes it can look pretty daunting to know that you've got to go and book 5 calls every single week. You've got to go and fulfill those calls. You've got to go and actually fulfill on any clients that you do sell to. Maybe you've got to build a bit of a brand, a personal brand, all this kind of stuff to go and build an agency. How do you actually get that done? And that's what I'm going to cover in this video, because even though we have such a short amount of time in a day, most people aren't prepared to work more than 8 or 10 hours per day. We still need to get that done. And this is a topic which a lot of people seem to struggle with. And it really comes down to something which is super, super basic. And that is basically how efficient you are. And the way that you become efficient is by having focus. And what I seem to see is a lot of people are making their efficiency and their focus far, far, far worse than it could be, or that it would have been maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And that's through how involved and how incorporated everyone is in terms of the online space. And what I mean by that specifically is the kind of stuff that you are consuming, when you're consuming it, how often you're consuming it, and all of that stuff. So most people will tell you, like, don't go on TikTok, don't use short form content, don't do this kind of stuff because it's like super, super stimulating and it's like a really low effort to get the reward and all that kind of stuff, right? But in actual fact, what I've seemed to find is that even stuff that is, technically long form content, you need you to focus a little bit more, you are still basically overstimulating yourself. And so if you're ever trying to do a bit of work and you need to put some music on, you need to put a podcast on, you need to do something in the background that isn't just the work, then at this point you are overstimulating yourself. Now, the science behind this is you don't really need to know the science, to be honest with you. You just need to know the principle that if you are doing a certain task and you need to add in some kind of stimulus in order to complete that task, the next time you go to do that task, that stimulus will not be, just something which is needed. It's then something which you have to have it, right? Without this, then no work can be done, or at least less work can be done than if you don't have it at all. And so you basically just put yourself in this loop where you're constantly needing more and more and more stimulus in order to get the same amount of stuff done. Now, oftentimes people can speculate or assume that you basically need that stimulus to get the work done, right? But I would probably guess for most people that you actually don't really need it. It's just this sort of concept that you feel like you do. And even if you do and you are using it, the chance that you're going to be more productive, more efficient, you're going to get more things done by having someone talking in your ear while you're listening to a podcast is probably not true, right? It doesn't really bear any sort of scientific proof. There's no real evidence to say that it does, but people still believe this and they still put themselves through these, really highly stimulating scenarios where they can't actually do as much work as they would want to. And people don't even realize that they're doing it. I've fallen into the trap many times where I'm like, oh, I don't consume, short form content. I barely watch YouTube videos. So like, I'm completely fine, right? But in actual fact, I was basically stimulating myself through loads of different scenarios where I'm constantly listening to podcasts. I get through like 2 podcasts in a day, right? I'm listening to podcasts like just before I go to sleep, or even while I'm trying to sleep, I fall asleep to them sometimes. Or I'll, go for a walk, try to go for something which is pretty calming, try to have like a thinking session and think about different ideas and stuff like that, try to clear my mind. But then I'll end up putting on a podcast or putting on some kind of, stimulating content, which is just the complete opposite of what that whole task is supposed to do. It's not going to clear your mind at that point. It's actually going to make things worse. And so when you come back in, or when you're trying to do some work, or you're trying to basically refresh yourself, the opposite of what you want is actually going to happen, because you no longer feel refreshed. You no longer had that gap. Work is no longer this thing where you're trying to get things done and clear your brain. It's actually the thing that is stimulating you at this point, because you're going to tie work into something which is stimulating, which is, a complete nightmare in terms of productivity. And I also see a lot of people doing this one thing, which is speeding things up. So people watching this probably now are watching this at like 1.5, 2 times speed, maybe even higher. And so one thing I see as well, which lots of people do, is they actually speed things up. So they speed up a podcast or a content or anything like that. It's like 1.5, 2 times speed. There's probably someone watching this right now but it's watching it on double speed. But the issue with that is you're basically condensing the amount of content and information that you have into a short amount of time. And even though you are saving time and you are actually making this less, it doesn't actually consume as much time for your day. So obviously you can listen to the podcast and then it finishes, and then you can go on and do your work. But actually what tends to happen is people finish it and then they just start another one, which is basically what I was doing, and I don't really see why you would just suddenly stop. The benefit of actually speeding things up is that it takes less time. But if you dedicate like 30 minutes to do this task, then you're probably just going to fill that time with that podcast, right? If the podcast finishes, you're probably going to put another one on. If you're watching YouTube videos or Netflix or whatever else, you're probably just going to put another one after that, right? So I don't think the idea of speeding things up actually makes things any better. In fact, I would argue that it makes it far worse, because you're just putting in so much content that you're just overloading yourself, right? It's extra stimulation. And oftentimes, if you are doing this where you're basically just putting on in the background or doing something, while you're working, but you're not actually solely focusing on this, then you're just splitting your attention at this point. What is starting to happen is you're not really listening to that thing that's on there inside, that thing that's, should be in the background. And so you're not actually registering anything, informative that's said, or let's say you're watching something which might give you some kind of entertainment value. You're not really getting that entertainment value because you're not really paying attention to what it is, but it is taking some of your attention away, but not enough to actually consume that content, but it's taking enough of your energy away from the work so that it's actually going to harm your work. And so this is something that I've seen time and time again. People don't actually realize that they are doing this. But now I want to talk about some ways where you can actually start to improve this, and actually things you can do to counteract this, right? Because some people, that whatever they do, they just won't be able to actually do this. They just want to have scenarios where they are stimulated, and then so much counteract that so they can be less stimulated, so there's a balance through their day. And so this is some ways you can actually do it. First one's a bit of a no-brainer, which is meditation, which is something which a lot of people talk about. You literally just need to do 10-20 minutes of trying to think about nothing, just focus on your breath, and just make sure that the thoughts of work or just general life or anything else just doesn't come into your head. If it does, you just acknowledge the fact that that happened, and then you just go back to focusing on your breath. There's loads of YouTube videos out there showing you how to do this, but it's just a part of your morning schedule. It should be. So do this like 4 or 5 times a week, and then after like a significant amount of time, you basically realize that you don't need to be stimulated anymore, right? It's just a case where you can actually focus on one thing. Your thoughts are a little more clearer. If you ever have a conversation with someone and you lose track of what you're saying, this happens far less. It just seems to give you a lot more energy and a lot more clarity when it comes to doing some kind of cognitive task. And the next thing is just making some kind of conscious effort to not put something else into your work for at least an hour of your day, right? Let's say, for example, you don't do it until 11 a.m. or something like that, or you don't do it until you have your first break. Something like that, you put it in place every single day and you make it a non-negotiable. This is what happens. It's going to actually make sure that you are getting a significant chunk of your day done before you're actually starting to stimulate yourself, right? And there's a lot of people in business who talk about the fact that they don't take meetings after like 2 p.m. because they just get everything done in the morning, and after 2 p.m. they just don't want to do anything anymore. Their brain's kind of checked out, and this is what they want to do before this point, right? So after 2 p.m. this is when stimulation just goes through the roof. And so if you set something like that up in your day, where you're going to say, before midday, I'm not going to consume any content, I'm not going to listen to music, podcasts, YouTube videos, Netflix, anything like that. I'm just going to do either exercise, work, just stuff that's actually productive. Then you're going to have a very clear, conscious effort in your day to make sure that it doesn't happen. And you're going to have that contrast between, things that aren't stimulating you and then things later in the day that probably are. And the next one is something which I don't see people talking about, at least anyway, in the agency space. And this is going on walks, but just making sure that you don't put any sort of headphones in or you're consuming any sort of content while you're doing this, right? Lots of people go on walks and they put a podcast on, or they listen to music, or they do something like that. You can also do the same thing if you're going to the gym, so basically having no music, no headphones, nothing like that. And what this means is you're just going to be pretty bored, right? But if you're doing something, if you're exercising, if you're walking, if you're doing something to occupy your sort of boredom, then you start to actually create ideas. And I think there's some kind of like study on this. I read about it a long time ago, but it actually puts your brain in some kind of idea creation mode. So if you ever have like a time where you try to do a task, right, and you just can't do it, going away and walking for like 20-30 minutes and then coming back to it is going to put you in such a better chance and give you such a better opportunity to actually go and complete that task, because you've had a chance to reset your brain. You haven't had to be consuming this content when you're thinking about something else, or your brain's just being like sidetracked by something else. You clear your thoughts, you go from a bit of a reset, and then when you come back to things, you have a better idea on things look a little bit easier. And I've done this so many times where I've had a certain thing that I just can't get my head around, or just things just aren't clicking, just whatever it is, a certain task just doesn't make sense to you. And then you give it like another day, or you give it a few hours, you come back to it after you've actually refreshed your brain and you've cleared your mind, and things are just like, it looks obvious. It's like, how did I not get this before? It's almost like something's changed in the actual task that you were doing, because it's so easy now compared to what it was before. But this is just such a sick hack. If you just actually just do something which is, you know, a little bit stimulating, but it's kind of natural, like going to the gym or walking or something like that. Make sure you don't consume any content, so you get that kind of stimulation, so you're not actually bored, but it's not enough stimulation, and it's pretty natural stimulation to the point where you can actually counteract that stimulation, that sort of artificial stuff that you're going to be consuming later in the day. So yeah, if you're not doing this, and if you're not incorporating stuff like this into your life, and you are listening to podcasts when you sleep, you are skipping music songs and listening to stuff on 2x speed all the time, try and incorporate it. Just give it 1 week. That's literally all it takes. But once you do this and you get into a bit of a rhythm of things, then you're probably going to be in a lot better situation to get your work done and actually complete the tasks that you're probably looking at and thinking, you know, how on earth am I going to do this? But yeah, if you like the video, like it, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.